Hi, guys. So, in the next section of this chapter on the Industrial Revolution, we're going to look more closely at the rise of the cities. Specifically, we are going to look at how the Industrial Revolution changed life in the cities, right? So, the things you should be able to do by the end of this video is summarize the impact of the medical advances during this time, how cities changed by 1900, and then also the working class struggles and the way that that's going to eventually lead to improved conditions for workers. So, first, when we look at medicine, there's a few different things coming into play here. One is that the agricultural revolution that we had talked about at the beginning of learning about the Industrial Revolution, that agricultural revolution leads to a better diet. And then you couple that with science beginning to understand the role that, dirty utensils, unclean blankets play, and the role that you need to have for sanitation, basic sanitation. And because of those things, you have a much lower death rate. So when you look at the fight against diseases, there's a couple things that are going on, and these are happening kind of throughout Europe at the time. More and more, they're beginning to understand that there are these tiny microscopic things that we can't really see with the naked eye. And these things cause disease. And today we know them as like viruses and bacteria. And as they get better at this, understanding this, and then you get a handful of people, for example, you have the French chemist Louis Pasteur, the German doctor Robert Koch, and then the British doctor John Snow. And these scientists are able to prove that there's a link between these unseen germs and getting sick. And that is called the germ theory. And understanding that germ theory, the knowledge that we gained from that, it's really going to help us figure out how to make things like vaccines, which is incredibly important in today's world, right? During COVID, without the germ theory, we would be lost right now. It would be disaster. So some of these things you're learning about in the Industrial Revolution are very important even to today. They're relevant. So again, they're going to help us figure out how to make vaccines, or the differences between viruses and bacteria. We learn that as well over time, and all of that is going to begin to form all of that knowledge during this time and get better as time goes on. Now, they got a lot of ways to go, a long ways to go before they figure out the difference between a virus and bacteria, but at least they're moving in that right direction. So, regarding hospital care and trigger warning, some of these things are gross. So, they go to this idea of cleanliness is next to godliness. That's what they view it. So, the fact that they are starting to use antiseptics, that they're starting to make sure that they clean things out and that they prevent infections, like the infection you see up here on the left-hand picture. All of those types of things are going to make hospitals a much better place to go. And you're going to have fewer people who are dying from these things. And then they're able to live into an older age. They're able to survive. And all of these things are going to work together to improve healthcare and contribute to this population explosion that occurs as a result of the Industrial Revolution. One of the people most responsible for this shift in thinking was Florence Nightingale, and she was a British nurse, an army nurse in the British Army during the Crimean War, when Britain and Russia went to war with one another in the mid 1800s. And Nightingale, she helped to introduce new sanitary measures in hospitals, and she actually even founded the very first school of nursing in the world. And it was those sanitary measures, the sterilization of instruments, using antiseptics, keeping things clean, that helped people to survive operations and to prevent them from dying from infections while in the hospital. So it made the hospital stay even better than it had been before. So next, when you look at city life, now, one of the problems that they're running into, especially in these old European cities and even some of the older cities on the East Coast of the United States, like Boston, is that they just kind of grew up organically. There wasn't necessarily a plan. It wasn't a planned city. It was kind of like, well, we'll just keep kind of building in this direction. And what you've got is you've got these very narrow streets, like in the picture you see in the top right, these very medieval narrow streets that aren't equipped for modern transportation, right? Imagine trying to fit cars through that. Not going to happen, right? They were fine for walking, and all these original cities needed to be walking cities originally. You had to be able to get everywhere you wanted to go by walking, whether it be church or school or the grocery store, whatever, to work and home. You had to be able to walk in those times. Well, now that we've got modern transportation, that kind of goes out the window. So, especially in some of these older cities, you start to see them tear down the old buildings, tear up the old streets, and replace them with these wide boulevards and public buildings, tearing down the tenements and trying to get a little bit better. And we call that renewal, urban renewal. And one of the other things you see is that the rich and the middle class, especially the upper middle class, begin to move to the outskirts of the cities into the suburbs. And then the poor, they live in the inner city right next to the factories. So you're going to start to see this differentiation of classes based on where they live. Um, Other things are going to change again. Technology leads to all kinds of improvement and something called urban renewal, like I said, which was a rebuilding of the poor areas of the city. So, one, you've got sidewalks, as they put it in these wide boulevards, you're able to get to different places throughout the city much more easily. With street lights, not those gas lamps anymore, because those gas lamps are pretty dangerous, but with street lights, electric street lights, you're able to light the city, the whole city at night, relatively safely. And that's going to help the police force and cut down on crime. Especially if you watch, I'm going to have you watch that Jon Snow, the Pump Street extra credit video, the Ed Puzzle. And one of the things they really figure out is sewage. Human sewage is horrible in terms of carrying microbes and bacteria. And so by having these underground sewers and taking that sewage away from drinking water and out of the city, that's going to help cut down on illnesses, disease, and death. It will decrease the death rate. And then the other thing you need to do is, as these cities become more crowded, you need to build up, because you can't go out very much further. You're running out of space, at least because it gets kind of impractical, right? Imagine how, if you just kept going outward, how hard it would be to get to the center of the city where the factories are. It would be very impractical. So you start to get skyscrapers, and they're using the new materials like iron and steel, right? They're using some of these new industrial revolution inventions that we've kind of talked about to produce these skyscrapers. So if we look at next the city life for the urban poor, basically it's these slum-like conditions. It's extremely overcrowded. You've got these tenement buildings where you've got multiple families living in just one single room, right? They're all close in together. There's not any privacy whatsoever. That's, kind of the downside of the city life, right? Now, on the upside of the city life, some of the things that lure the people there to the cities is that it's more exciting. There's more things to do now. This is also where people are working. And then there's those social, recreational, educational opportunities that you can't find in the rural areas, but you can find them in the bigger cities, in the urban areas. So, for example, you can go to the opera. You can go to a music hall and see a concert or a drama performance. You can go to a museum, a library, or watch sports like tennis and boxing. And so all these things are going to factor together to cause urbanization, this rapid growth of cities and these big, huge cities. And one of the things that's going to happen over time is, through the Industrial Revolution, you're also going to start to see these mutual aid societies that are going to eventually form into kind of like labor unions. So these mutual aid societies did all kinds of different things to help the urban poor. They were basically self-help groups formed by workers to help those workers who had become sick or injured. And then once you get, legalized labor unions where workers are united with each other, there's strength in numbers. They're able to use those numbers and to get more money and better working conditions. One of the key tools that labor unions have used to get those better working conditions and to try to improve their living conditions is work stoppage. They can go on strike, meaning they can all agree to stop working, and they can shut down an entire business. And of course, that doesn't really go over well with the factory owners, and you really see a negative reaction, and even some governments have a negative reaction to it. And you have these strike busters that kind of pop up, these groups. So for the United States, it's this group called the Pinkertons. They would a lot of times get hired by big factory company owners. They'd get hired to come in and bust up strikes. They were, kind of a rough and tumble crew, and would violently attack the workers who were striking, and teach them to not do that again. But the other thing is you start to see, despite that, you see that the government moves away from that laissez-faire capitalism, and over time they really start to have regulation and reform. And it kind of takes a long time, but for example, they start to pass child labor laws, where kids under the age of 10, you know, aren't allowed to go into the workforce. Now that takes a lot longer in the United States. They're pretty resistant to telling parents what they can and can't do with their children, but you do start to see that happening. You start to see them limiting the number of hours that workers can work, especially in really dangerous places like mines. So little by little, bit by bit, the government's going to get involved, and there will be regulation and reform to address some of these issues. The other thing that you start to see over time is that there is a gradual rise in the standard of living. And the standard of living basically is a measurement of the quality and availability of the necessities and comforts of life. So, in other words, people are able to not just be able to afford necessities of life, food, right, shelter, but they're also able to get other things that are just nice to have kind of things. Like today, that would be the internet for us. That's very nice to have. Um, and that's a sign of a good Wi-Fi connection to the internet. That's a sign of a developed nation, right? So a higher standard of living. That's what that would mean. The one problem, though, during this period is that the gap between the workers and the middle class is actually going to really widen during this part of the Industrial Revolution, so that the standard of living didn't really increase much for the working class. It did for the upper class, it did for the middle class, but the working class was not seeing as much of an increase. But as more and more people are moving into that middle class, their standard of living is really increasing. So let me know if you have any questions about this assignment, and I'll be sure to help you out.